But all of those conditions have changed recently. The most obvious way to look at it is just in terms of demographics. China is in the state where the labor force has already plateaued and is just beginning to inch down. And then after about another decade, the labor force is going to shrink. Right? So that restrains growth potential, obviously. The migration from the countryside to the cities has already crested. And there's still a lot of it, but compared to 10 years ago when 10 million people a year were moving from the countryside to the city, now it seems to be down to about 2 million or 3 million. So again, much less potential from that. So as the Chinese leaders look at this potential slowdown, they have said now pretty clearly, no, we're going to do everything we can to prevent this slowdown. We recognize that the era of 10% per year growth is over, but we're going to try and defend a growth rate that's above 6%. That's still not bad, right? People in the U.S. would kill for a 6% growth rate, and people in Mexico would kill for a 6% growth rate. But even in China, in order to produce this growth rate, we're seeing the role of very aggressive, dramatic policies. These policies go along with an effort to keep the investment rate high. So China still has, again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but China has the investment rate that is not only by far the highest in the world today, again, it's the highest that any other country has ever experienced in history, period. So China grows fast because China has a high investment rate, but all the other supporting conditions that were in place to produce this 3 decades of miracle growth, these are all changed. So what has the Chinese government decided to do to keep growth high? Well, of course, investment, but this investment in particular has sort of 3 specific directions. The first, and by far the most important, is high-tech, high-tech industry. And of course, we can go over the whole range of high-tech sectors. And what's astonishing, making an effort in every single one of them. One of the areas where we've seen the most impact in the U.S. market already, of course, is solar panels. China became the dominant producer of solar panels. China is now pouring money into electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, telecom infrastructure. The list goes on, and we can talk about lots of these sectors if you wish. The second big area is infrastructure, because China, over the last 7 years, really, it's not even a decade, over the last 7 years, began to build, I guess I wasn't leaning over enough. Now I can lean back. Began to pour money first into expressways and then into high-speed rail. And now the program called One Belt, One Road, or impact on our world. And the third area is China has now committed to urban reconstruction plans for each one of its biggest urban centers. In Beijing, they're going to build a new city called Xiong'an, about 100 kilometers from Beijing, and develop a kind of triangle, Beijing, Tianjin, Xiong'an triangle, to completely restructure this urban area. Outside of Shanghai, where you already have sort of 10 small or medium-sized cities that kind of radiate out from Shanghai, they're going to rebuild this into a corridor of medium-sized cities. And yes, that's much louder, isn't it? What the Chinese government has done for the last 40 years has been to incentivize growth through investment. And it's done so by making every local government official incentives to grow the GDP and the fiscal revenues of everything of those particular local governments. So why is this time different? All right, here's 4 reasons. Number 1, it's just bigger. It's way bigger, right? China's economy, of course, is already the 2nd largest in the world, probably catch up with the United States around 2035. size. And so a similar effort on the part of China would be much bigger than it was 10 or 20 years ago. But this is not even a similar effort. This is by far a larger proportional mobilization of resources. China has semiconductor investment fund, several funds. When you add them all together, they're 130 billion US dollars for semiconductors. That's one industry. It's crazy. The second, I can explain maybe the bigger side too by getting to the second point here, which is China's developed a system of what we might call financialization, invested in something else by selling the firms or listing them on the public market, or in other ways developing some kind of exit strategy. So it's bigger, it's more financialized, and it's growing incredibly rapidly. So when I said the funds at the end of 2017 were 1.3 trillion US dollars, that's not quite double, but about 80% more than what it was at the end of 2016, which was double what it was at the end of 2015. So this is a curve that looks like that. This is money flooding into the system, and it's going to have an impact everywhere, but especially on high-tech industry everywhere. Now, there's two more reasons why this is different. The first is going to sound a little strange. In some ways, there's a stronger Communist Party role in doing this than there has been for a long time. This is most evident in state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises, about 30 years ago, China said, we made a mistake in the past. We made a mistake because the Communist Party was too directly involved in running businesses. And we're going to create a new system where the factory manager, the CEO, is the boss. And there'll still be a party secretary, but his job is to sort of keep morale up and transmit the political decisions and definitely play a subsidiary role. Now, under Xi Jinping, they've got a whole new push going on. Xi Jinping is basically saying, you're going to be a party member, you got to believe it. This is revivalism. And at the enterprise level, what it means is these firms are establishing new corporate companies like Huawei, which I know has a substantial presence here in Mexico. And here's a company that I think develops its outstanding reputation on the basis of real skills and genuine research and real capabilities, got adopted by the Chinese government ex post as a national champion, right? Once they were successful, the government was happy to come in and say, yes, you represent us, you're part of our development drive. And so Xi Jinping is sort of redefining the objectives both of the Communist Party and of government policy to make it more nationalistic, to make the new stage of high-tech development a part of the China dream and a part of China moving to the center, as he says, moving to the center of the global stage. So this is ambition. There's a lot of ambition here. So the third point of three. This is sufficiently ambitious that there are a lot of risks and there are a lot of clashes, I think, inevitably ahead. Let's just start with the United States. Of course, everybody looks at the United States and we try and figure out what is Donald Trump going to do next, and we don't know. I don't know. But all I can say is, within Washington, there are many different groups that are trying to shape American policy toward China, and it's probably fair to say that all of these groups are alarmed. And so there's at least two policies that are already working their way through the American government and will certainly become policy within the next year. The first is trade restrictions on steel and aluminum, of all strange things to start with. This has been bubbling up through the U.S. Trade Representative. China is a major focus of this sort of protectionist effort, but it's not limited to China. And the second is, you may or may not know that the U.S. has a very slender review process for incoming investment called CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. I don't even know what it stands for. We always call it CFIUS. That rarely blocks an investment, but occasionally does, and only has a national security remit. There's a bill in Congress, it will certainly pass in one form or another, that dramatically expands CFIUS, definitely expands the definition of what threatens national security to include a wide range of high-tech projects, and in the current version includes review of outgoing investment by American firms in China if they involve too much, quote-unquote, of technology to China. Now that provision may not survive. Obviously, a lot of businesses oppose that very vehemently. But we're looking at a new regime in U.S.-China relations, and it's going to happen in the next year or two regardless of what Donald Trump, well, no, that's not true. Donald Trump could disrupt anything, but it's not something that's happening primarily because of an individual. So that's one type of clash. Of course, the other problem is, I think, much more related to China itself. We're talking about a China that there is no doubt about it, and actually Enrique and I were just discussing this just before we came in here. There's no doubt that China is an incredibly dynamic economy that is upgrading technologically virtually everywhere. Right? There's no question China is narrowing the gap between the global technology frontier and the best Chinese producers. That's happening for sure. But what's happening is, in this context where China is sort of half catching up, all of a sudden China is pouring money into these sectors. And thus it's, in a sense, disequilibrating these sectors. Now, at the moment, everybody's happy, right? Because you're looking at firms that have a fair amount of capability, and then in addition, you're pouring in government subsidy money. Of course, people are happy, right? They seem, it's a great place to be right now. There's tons of startups in China, and it's a bubble, right? It's a huge bubble, and we don't know what the outcome is going to be. The biggest worry is this. You've got government officials playing with $1 trillion of other people's money. They're investing in risky high-tech businesses. You know, in Silicon Valley, if you talk to a venture capitalist, he'll say, you know, 9 of my 10 investments will fail, but the one that succeeds should pay for the 9 that fail. Now in China, you're giving essentially government officials, very savvy, very smart people with a lot of experience, but still government officials the right to make the same portfolio of investment choices without really a clear sense of exactly how you manage failure, exactly what you do with the 9 out of 10 startups that don't make it. And I think this is profoundly, has the potential to be profoundly destabilizing in China, particularly in a situation in which China already has a very large debt overhang. Right? China, because of the way the growth slowdown has occurred, China has a very high debt to GDP ratio. Depending upon how you want to look at it, if you make the most inclusive calculations, it's about 330% of GDP in total debt. It has a high saving rate, so there are a lot of reasons why it can sustain this and succeed in deleveraging. But now we have a whole new wave of investment coming in, and China so far hasn't created the institutional capability to deal with the bad debt that will inevitably be created. So those are my 3 main points. You know, just to recap briefly, you know, China, instead of slowing down, which is a hard thing to do, is pouring money into these new areas, pouring money into these new areas is presenting challenges for the whole world, but also for China. We can say for sure a lot of this money is going to be wasted.
To create a unique framework of knowledge and, of course, a stage of a better understanding of Chinese financial reality. Furthermore, it's very important to thank you, Enrique, for also your leadership and China-Mexico Center at National University in Mexico. We are more than glad to improve and basically just to bring this effort of the China-Mexico professorship for, this is the fourth time, right? So we are more than glad to host you here in Mexico City. And just to say, just to make a remark of what you already said, I believe that financial geopolitics of China is going not merely to reshape all the Western economic order, but moreover, Mexico needs to understand our short-term future and to create a strategy, because if we don't pay attention on that, we are going to lose much more than an a strategic opportunity to create not merely a better reality for our country. Right now, we are trying to renegotiate the NAFTA. So your insights, they're incredibly important to create our public policy framework, first. But second is just to understand that the trilateral relationship between Canada, US, and Mexico is very extremely important to create a trilateral agenda with China. So for that reason, I just want to remark, and I just want to stress again on the point, thank you for COMEXI for all the efforts. Thank you, Mariana. And I'm sure this is not going to be the last, but the first effort to understand and enhance the relationship between Mexico and China. Thank you very much for all your presence here. Thank you. Thank you, Enrique.
Look, very briefly and trying to allow for this dialogue. No? So I think Professor Naughton has been very clear in highlighting briefly some of the topics that he believes are relevant in understanding China in 2018. No? So the topic of a new quality of growth in China, no? Which does not necessarily mean then that China will continue growing at 6–7%, but that there is a new content in growth. No? One topic. No? All these issues full of risks internationally in the relationship with the United States, massive domestic challenges, social, political, environmental, economic challenges. I would simply highlight what does this mean for Mexico today. No? No, it would be easy to say, well, ¿y por qué yo? No, because I don't care. I remind you, no, in 2018, it's one of these key years. No, in 2018. We're going to live the 15 years, 1–5, since China has become the second major trading partner of Mexico. No? It's one of these years, no, that you can forget. I remember a couple of years ago we could have had festivities of 50 years of maquiladoras. No? Nobody remembered, but well, okay. So 15 years of China being the second trading partner, and China is not going to go away on the contrary, it's increasing its presence. And so I would highlight first the enormous importance of institutions to generate knowledge on China. No? This is one of the main topics that Mexico is lacking. We are not investing sufficiently in public institutions, in private institutions, academic institutions. We're all involved in that, no? And we know firms, business organizations, and many others that say, yes, tomorrow, no? For sure tomorrow. 15 years again that China is massively involved in Mexico, and many people say tomorrow, no? Secondly, it is critical to elaborate. We've been discussing this with Simón and others. It is critical that Mexico elaborates a very detailed agenda vis-a-vis China. What do we want from China? No? We are very good in complaining on China. No? What we want from China after several decades of experiences with China? Professor Naughton is telling us what are some of the initiatives and expectations of China. If you want to engage in a detailed discussion with China, you have to know the One Belt, One Road strategy. You have to know what China is proposing, the white papers of China vis-a-vis Latin America, the CELAC forum, the proposals of Xi Jinping when he came here in 2013. We have to know about this, and again, I think there is not sufficient knowledge, patience, financing, foreign direct investment. Do we want to attract Chinese foreign direct investment or not? What are the experiences, sense of experiences? Why doesn't China invest in Mexico? Why does China invest in Panama, but not in Mexico? No? What are the problems? So we need specialists. We have to invest in this relationship, and we haven't done it. And finally, related to the One Belt, One Road strategy, infrastructure. No? Mexico is the world champion in failures in infrastructure projects from China. Of 3 attempts, 3 failures. No? The one what's the name in Cancun, then Dragon Mart, no? Failure, fast speed train, failure, Chicoacén 2 in Chiapas, failure. Okay, so China says, my friends, I don't understand you, no? You have reached a really high ranking in the failures, no? And finally, third topic, and I mentioned it, China is playing a profound role in the relationship, in this new triangular relationship between Mexico, the United States, and China. No? In 2016, according to the US data, China became the #1 trading partner of the United States. No? It used to be Canada. 5 years ago, Mexico used to be the second or third one, and so China is the major trading partner of the US, the second of Mexico, and the second of Canada. And in not only in umbrellas, but in auto parts, in telecommunications, in electronics, etc., China is playing a key role in the integration process of NAFTA. No? So again, all these are invitations to say, Mexico, when are you going to wake up? No? Today, tomorrow, in other 15 years, maybe it's a little bit late, no? Better yesterday and not tomorrow. And I think again that Professor Naughton is giving us a group of concepts and detailed issues where Mexico could pay attention to start working better yesterday than tomorrow. No? So thank you very much, and I would say the floor is yours to have a dialogue with Professor Naughton. No?
Thank you very much, Professor Naughton and Professor Dussel, Simón. Thank you very much for your very valuable insights. My name is Marco Hernandez. I work at the International Finance Corporation with the team that manages China-Mexico, which is a fund that's trying to work on that space that has not been exploited. Regarding these, I'm going to say reconfiguration. Probably it has a more a better name of the Chinese economy. Can you give us more insight on what role does foreign investment plays in this reconfiguration in general, and in Latin America and Mexico in specific?
I'm going to sort of pass on all Latin America specific problems, just because there are people who've studied that and understand it much better than me. In terms of the reconfiguration in China, incoming foreign investment in China has been a smaller and smaller part of GDP for almost 20 years now. So the days when foreign investment was the key driver in the restructuring of China are over. China right now is very ambivalent. And in particular, if you think of it in terms of production chains, as you know well, and as Enrique has done a lot of work on this, if we think of a production chain as oversimplifying, having a core technology link and then a bunch of different steps before and after, the centerpiece of Chinese policy these days is we want to master the core technology, which means, in a sense, turning away from the existing cross-border production networks. Now, of course, when they face a particular case, then they swing to the opposite. So China still wants Apple to assemble their phones in China, and just spent billions creating a new zone for Apple's, totally dedicated to the Apple company. They bonded custom zone, a special airport, all this in inland China because they can justify it both in terms of trade and in terms of regional development policy, blah, 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 right? Even while other aspects of their policy are saying, we don't want a company like Apple that controls all the core technologies in the phone and relegates us to the position of assembler.
They are the yuan is now considered as a reserve currency. That was the first. The second, it was linking Shanghai and Hong Kong stock exchanges. That was the second. I mean, talking financially, because as you say, you are talking about an economic 30 years miracle. It's not that they were born like this. And the third, I might say, is that Hong Kong is a really free market for money. I mean, you can go there and exchange really $500,000, and they are not asking you what you had for breakfast yesterday, as in many other parts of the world. On the other hand, I think China is only 40 years behind United States, and they are doing exactly the same that United States did after the Second World War. It's, I mean, they are not inventing something new. They are rebuilding the world with the Chinese infrastructure bank, like the UN, like many of the banks that they were born after the Second World War. So, and they are, of course, improving their internal market. As you know, internal market in China is way different than what we heard here. And third, innovation. Yeah, it's something important. The party, of course, it's intervening the same that the United States government intervened in the 50s, 60s, 70s. That everything was made in the United States, not in anywhere else. So I see a lot of similarities between China and the United States. I'm not criticizing any one of them, but at that time I used to speak more fluent Chinese than I do now. So I remember once you go there, and you, for Enrique, for example, talking what Mexicans need to understand that the low wages in China is not their competitive advantage. Need to understand why China became like they are now. I just wrote a short article, not long, 2 weeks ago. The question was why China in the late 70s and the 80s, when the United States migrated their business to China, they didn't stay with the Maquila scheme, and we did. I mean, the United States would have never moved to China if they thought that China was going to become this monster. So, but at that time, that decision was right. But in Mexico and Latin America, I mean, we haven't learned to make something by ourselves. I mean, assembling is one thing. I'm not criticizing auto parts, nothing in Mexico, okay? Just creating some value. Why? There are many possible answers to that, but I mean, I just wanted to complement that with you. It's brilliant, and I really think that Mexico, I don't know other countries in the world, we have a lot to learn from China to become really not an important country.
Could be very difficult in that context. I would like to know your opinion. Thank you.
Good, that's a great question, and you're right. It's a really difficult challenge. I think for at least 2 years, China will be very careful that it always responds, because it understands that tit for tat is an effective bargaining relationship. But it will also try to under-respond in order to take the moral high ground and present itself as the champion of a new kind of global order. China, Xi Jinping clearly believes that he refers often, and I'm sorry, I'll take a little loop and I'll come back to your more specific question. Xi Jinping often refers to this period of strategic opportunity, which also means period of heightened risk. But strategic opportunity in the sense that not only is China catching up, but the U.S. is backing away from its responsibilities and commitments that the U.S. has made. And that this gives China certain short-run opportunities that it wouldn't otherwise have. So that's clearly, what they think. And I think they're right? I mean, that doesn't mean that their approach is necessarily correct in a deeper sense, but that Donald Trump China is, I think, undeniable, right? And so therefore, in these clashes, I think China will try very hard to be seen as the wounded party, and therefore not to retaliate too strongly and to be very targeted. We sort of assume there'll be retaliation against American farm goods, especially soybeans, and probably just enough disruption introduced into some of the production chains we were talking about, so that Apple, for instance, is going to Washington and saying, hey, this hurts, without totally destroying the goose that laid the golden egg. So I think in the short run, there'll be it's probably not going to be that big a drag on Mexico, but definitely to be watched and very challenging situation.
Enrique, you asked, first I would like to thank all of you, and Simón, more than anything, I want to thank you for making this happen. So thank you so much. Also, I have a question to Professor Dussel. You said that Mexico should start by asking ourselves the question of what can we or should we be asking from China? You knowing Mexico very well and knowing China, and Professor Naughton knowing the United States and China, I would like to ask you what probabilities or what could be really the strategy that Mexico could have with China, considering the fact that we have the United States not only as our northern neighbor, but also as our greatest trading partner and the biggest economy in the world.
Look, on this topic, I can simply, 2018, I don't see any political party today interested in the topic of China. No? We have to push and invite doing work, each of us. We are doing en lo que está en nuestro alcance, in what we can do, no? To highlight the importance of China in each of these topics, no? From sports to culture. We can do it. No? Last year, Mexico and China had a fantastic year regarding culture. No? More than almost 200 events regarding culture. So I would say the big challenge is to continue in culture, but also in academics, in trade, in investment, and many other topics. Unfortunately, again, institutions are very weak, the ones that want to work day to day regarding China. And so far, to be honest, in these institutions, public, private, and academic institutions, let's put it politely, we are not sufficient. No? You would imagine to have dozens of private institutions working on China. Not the case. 1, 2, 3, 4. We know each other with Amapola for too long. You would imagine many others. No? So is it possible? Yes, it is possible. Do we have the contents? I don't know if they are the correct, and they are all, but we have lots of contents. But I would say the political system, the executive in Mexico, 5 years under Enrique Peña Nieto, and the parties from the left to the right, etc., are not sufficiently interested on China today. No? To put it politely. No? They're simply not interested. No, it's not in the agenda. That's my day-to-day reality. No? To be very blunt, no interest. No, but again,
I would like to add you something about the answer. First of all, you reject something when you don't understand that. So that's why Mexican government rejects that, because they don't understand the Chinese reality. So to answer your question, in my opinion, is we need to understand that the answers, they're not outside, they are inside. We need to define our industrial policy framework, if we need to have it or not. In terms of international trade with China, do we have something to really to export to China? Do we have export offer here? Where is the strategy? Where is, of course, we launched Aero-Mexico flight 9 years ago, no, 10 years ago, 9 years ago. But where is the strategy that we're built for that point? So there are a lot of constellations, everything there is spread, but there is not a line of a strategy, a smart strategy to build a comprehensive pattern, and just to understand where we need to go with China. And I think in this year, in July, we will have a strong opportunity, not merely to define who is going to be our president, but moreover, to understand where our country, in terms of economy, in terms of industrial public policy, in terms of wages, where are we need to go? So I think the answer is in our hands and is not in external hands.
Closer together, or
I'm sure Donald Trump will blame you for everything. So no matter what you do, Donald Trump will blame you for it. Let me take a step back, because I think what's going to happen in the next 2 years is that the United States and Europe, including especially Germany, will adopt much more stringent review regimes for China. And they'll probably go a little too far, right? So China will feel, and it will perhaps be objectively true, that you know, there's a kind of discrimination against Chinese investment. At the same time, lots of countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, will welcome Chinese investment, and they'll say, you know, we're ready, we want it. Although, of course, it's very complicated, right? A country like Vietnam is deeply conflicted about what to do. So in a way, the world will kind of split. I think this, in a way, and maybe this is foolish, but in a way I think that provides an opportunity for Mexico to say, we continue to welcome investment on fair terms. These are the terms on which we welcome investment from everybody, including China. The U.S. is going to try to do that, but I don't know if the U.S. political system is going to be capable of generating that. Of course, maybe the Mexican political system has problems generating it too. I mean, it's a big problem. But I think there is a space, I think there's a sweet spot in between where you welcome Chinese investment under some sort of clear criteria and with good transparency. Obviously, those things are hard to achieve, but I think it's possible. And in that case, I don't think the reaction from the United States would be that strong.
But the more specific question is, if you think that U.S. government is going to allow that Mexico-China financial investment cooperation will go on.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, we're not that, you know, we don't have a comprehensive policy brain that can wrap all these things together into one thing. So I think there's space there. I don't think, you know, if Mexico is perceived as being the corrupt recipient of a corrupt Chinese power play, that would be terrible. You know, that will create problems for sure. That's why I'm saying a little bit of preparatory ground laying that says this is, you know, even if you said something like, we're going to build a high-speed rail and now we're going to open it up to, you know, to bidding and different, we know the Chinese are going to win, but, you know, these are the terms.
Thank you, Dr. Naughton, y gracias a Simón y a Enrique. Creo que hacen un trabajo estupendo de traernos este nivel de reflexiones a nuestro país. So thank you, Dr. Naughton. This is Amapola Grijalva from the Hong Kong Trade Development Council. So I am really, really surprised to know that you have covered most of the let's say, the things that matter about the trends for the Chinese economy. So you finalize your presentation stating that for the next 10 years, we should expect a different kind of growth, not a different model. So my question to you is, speaking of this new era of a new China, what is the perception from the US in terms of, are we really interested as a hemisphere dominated by the US economy to link more and this kind of very multinational, global
attitude? I'm not defending it, but the most common feeling is, well, gee, we welcomed China into the world system, and now that it's big and powerful, it tells us that it only wants to play on its terms, and we're pissed. That's the dominant American attitude. Now, you know, obviously that's not, you know, the whole reality, but you know, there's so many corporate ties with China. There's the economic links are so deep and so complex. And so everybody's sort of sitting there and trying to figure out, how do we relate to this new world? We're not in, I say we, I'm generically as Americans, that this incredibly vibrant and diverse Chinese society, which has developed just as we thought it would, you know, it's become so complex and so interesting, but the political system under Xi Jinping has become tighter and more controlled. And as of right now, we don't see, you know, Chinese people, I think Xi Jinping is still quite popular. And so there's not a huge tension in China about this. So we feel our policy has failed in two senses, right? The sort of international sense and the domestic sense. So we're sort of in limbo right now. But it wouldn't take that big an adjustment on the part of either or both of the two countries to create a new configuration. The relationship's deep and intense. That means it could get worse and it could get better.
I am Jose Jorge.
No. Because I think, because first of all, I mean, I'm not sure that I understand the American policy, so, you know, and we're all wondering, and nobody knows for sure. But also, I think that President Trump is adept enough at us putting labels on people and assigning and grouping together enemies that would just backfire. And I mean, in a way, I mean, and the simplest message that we give to the Trump administration, people like myself, is, look, you need to worry about China. It doesn't mean you need to make it into an enemy, but you need to have a set of consistent policies with your allies who agree on a set of principles about economic cooperation, some of which, not all, were embodied in TPP. And it makes a lot more sense to be closer to your friends and a little bit tougher on China, because I believe that the Chinese political system works better.
So 2013, President Xi Jinping, we signed an agreement in which both Mexico and China highlighted this strategic association between both countries, and nobody knows what it means, no? So yes, we have a huge potential, but of course, I would say in this last 5 years and even longer, to be very clear and very blunt, unfortunately, we are in the hands of policymakers that do not understand China. Serra Puche, Herminio Blanco, Jaime Zabludovsky do not know of China, no? And what they are doing vis-a-vis TPP, and today insisting on TPP -1, I see you can form, it's called CPTPP, and you say, what is that, no? I would say, okay, I don't have anything against it, although I don't know one business chamber that has anything for it, no? But again, the government and this small group of policymakers insist that it is relevant to sign this agreement, no? Which, by the way, has explicit points against China, no? So the question is, and what about China, no? These friends, no? These very concrete friends, Grupo IQ, etc. What about China, no? No response, no? What about the Minister of Foreign Affairs, of the Secretaría de Economía, I don't see that they speak of China. How is that possible? And we insist on a CPTPP that nobody knows who will be benefited by this, no? So, unfortunately, we're in the wrong hands as a country, no? No idea, no discussion, no strategy, no concrete instruments. And we have lots of proposals, lots of proposals. Again, I can only invite you to look at the work that we've been doing together with other chambers. Are lots of proposals, no? And this has not been implemented. There is no discussion. This is the
one thing is
okay, I just wanted to add something.
Just without disagreeing with any of your substantive points, it does send a very nice message to the United States, which is, look, your friends are going ahead and doing this. Why aren't you with them? So,
I just want to bring to the table a sharper, concrete example, an opportunity that Mexico can create with China. You know, we have been discussing this is related about my last book. You know the reality of Mexican public debt. 48% of GDP is related right now. It's committed to pay the public debt. So I strongly believe that PPPs and the creation of regional development banks in Mexico, an example, Mexico City Development Bank, Guadalajara or Jalisco or Monterrey or Nuevo León development banks, I mean regional development banks, they're going to be created because in the short future, the challenges to create public infrastructure, they are going to be huge in Mexico. But the financial system and the scheme of the public debt in Mexico right now, they're taking out a lot and a very big part of the public budget. So I strongly believe that with the financial strong skills of China, they are going to push a lot to Mexico to bring here their financial influx and create PPPs projects. So there is a concrete opportunity in the term and the reality that I am thinking in consideration.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've been living during my whole life between Chinese people, relatives, and I thought that I was acquainted with Chinese. I'm not. And maybe the only reason is because the 1966, 1976 educational revolution changed completely the Chinese mentality. By far, my grandfather was not thinking in that way. My new Chinese friends, they are thinking black and white. So maybe we are living a new Chinese, not the Chinese that we used to know here in Mexico, in a Mexican community. They are completely different. It is, let me go into Enrique's issue as to why Chinese are not doing a good deal in Mexico. It seems to me, I've been advising mainly foreign companies doing business in Mexico from the legal and tax point of view. And I remember back in the mid-70s, late 70s, with Japanese companies, I remember specifically Canon, they told me once, Carlos, I don't know how to do business in Mexico. I don't understand Mexicans. It's too hard to understand you. We are so far, not geographically, but mainly our mind, our way of thinking is completely different. And it takes me to the Chinese way of thinking now. China became member to the WTO in 2001, and they thought that by being a member to WTO, they will be able to sell, not doing business in different countries, but to sell their products into the whole world. And why? Because they have still a lot of people, very poor people in mid-China and the West China, so they still have to create a lot of jobs. They do have a lot of jobs in the East Coast. They have no problem there. And Chinese, you're right, Enrique, when you're saying that they are making a great deal of business in Latin America, mainly Central America, Panama, Costa Rica. But they are so small countries that they accept Chinese entrepreneurs to do business in the Chinese way anytime. But do it, but please come and do it. Do business here, mainly infrastructure. In Mexico, I've been also advising Chinese companies trying to do business in Mexico to create infrastructure, to finance infrastructure through the Chinese Development Bank. And there is just no way for them to start doing business. The APP PPA procedure They just do not understand that, and it is very hard for the Mexican government to accept them. I've been fighting Pemex to accept Chinese companies in doing business in the infrastructure to CFE and to Pemex. So maybe the reason for not doing business so far is because they don't understand the Mexican way of doing business, and we don't understand the Chinese way of doing business. It'll take time, just like Japanese, it'll take time. But now let me go to you, Professor. Just was trying to make some additional information after dealing with 1, 2, 3 building companies, Chinese companies doing business in Mexico. They are ready. If you have any business, any infrastructure option, and you want to have it built in Mexico with Chinese financement, let me know. They can do it. They can finance it. Okay. And with that Monroe Doctrine was American for the Americans. With Obama administration, the TPP, definitely, I'm from NYU, and I was crystal clear in NYU that Obama blocked China to be a member of the TPP, is my understanding. I don't know what do you think, but I would like to hear from you about that issue. And mainly and also the second question, under the Trump administration, do we still have that position of this new administration versus China in America? Or is he going more America first, therefore, if China, they can do whatever business in Latin America? Where do you see the U.S. for the next 3 or 7 years ahead?
So I think the first thing we have to acknowledge that we cannot predict what Donald Trump is going to do. You know, I mean, just in the last day, he said, yes, we should have more restrictions on people buying guns, but we should arm teachers in the schools so that when school shooters come in, they can kill them quickly. You know, so the man is capable of any combination of different policy stances. The idea that TPP excluded or rejected China is really not true. Of course, there are provisions of the TPP that China would not have been able to meet, particularly code of conduct for state enterprises, but also accepting certain principles of regulatory regime that extended to the inside of the country, where China was clearly not ready to accept that. So China, even among Chinese economists, after there was this initial period where the official line was that TPP was an anti-China plot, but they quickly reached the point of realizing, first of all, that that wasn't productive as a sort of campaign, but also that there were elements of TPP that could potentially be positive to China as it looked for ways to open up. So really the big deal about TPP is not pro-China or anti-China, but a set of rules that were constructed by the US and Japan and Singapore and Australia in a way that served the interests of those countries and was less in the service of the interest of a country like China. And so it was about sort of who had the right to make the rules rather than who was in and who was out. Not that those are two totally separate questions, but you know, still it's more rules than in-group, out-group. So I don't think we can predict American policy into the future in terms of something as specific as whether the U.S. is okay with China in Latin America. There's an annual, I was shocked to learn this, there's an annual meeting in Beijing between the U.S. and China about what China can do in Latin America. Do you know that? Right? That was shocking to me. I mean, apparently the U.S. says to China, there are certain things no contact with the militaries.
That's why I asked that the question.
Okay. Okay. So there are limits, but in terms of sort of ordinary business activity, I don't, I think the American administration is completely preoccupied with 100 other things, so I wouldn't worry about it.
So thank you very much for your presence. And just one more thing. I want to share with all of you, Enrique. I just had feedback from my board. Just to share with you, we have a commitment with UNAM. We signed an agreement of 5 years. This is the fourth edition of the professorship. We are going to extend the agreement for 2 more years. So it's going to be 7 years. And we look forward to cooperate in more kind of efforts and strategies not merely with UNAM, just with COMEXI. Thank you very much for your presence. And again, Dr. Barry Naughton, thank you very much for your presence here, and it's an honor to host you here in Mexico City. Thank you.
Fabulosa me dieron, soy la suegra de Mariana. ¿Cómo estás? Pero una clase maravillosa, todos 3.